Well, I hope you enjoyed that intro. Now we're going to look at the emergence of a bipolar world. Now, the Cold War was rooted in ideological conflict between communism and capitalism and in a distrust between East and West stemming from their joint struggle against Nazi Germany. Communism and capitalism had always been hostile. Communists openly aimed to destroy world capitalism with its stress on individualism and competition, and replace it with a global community based on collectivism and cooperation. Faced with massive rebuilding and anxious to prevent future invasion, Stalin had several key goals. First of all, Germany must be incapacitated so it could not strike again. It must make huge reparation payments to rebuild the Soviet Union. And the Soviets must be shielded from Germany by a buffer zone of friendly countries in Eastern Europe. Now, in contrast, the Western powers opposed massive reparations and wanted free elections in Germany and in Eastern Europe. So therefore, Western goals were incompatible with Stalin's. But before the Cold War took off, there were some positive developments. One of those took place in April of 1945, and that was the development of the United Nations, in which 50 original nations agreed towards peace, security, equality, self-determination, international cooperation, human rights, and basic freedoms. It was arranged that no matter how large or how small the country, each was given one vote in the General Assembly. And a Security Council of 15 countries would be established, with 5 of the largest winners in World War II to be permanent members. Those were the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. In the Security Council, each country has the power to veto any decision made, even by a supermajority. Now, to keep from making the same mistakes as was done at the end of World War I, the Allies, that is, all the Allies except for the Soviet Union, sought to rebuild Germany instead of destroy it. So, between 1945 and 1949, Germany was occupied, and the Allies worked to disarm them so they could not wage another war. 4 zones were established between the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Now that was for all of Germany and also for the capital of Berlin. In the zones occupied by the United States, Great Britain, and France, they established democratic reforms. However, the Soviet Union demanded that Germany pay reparations, much in the form of industrial equipment, and became more communist-friendly. This showed a true conflict of interest. And on the other side of the world, there was Japan. You can see in this photograph General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of the rebuilding of Japan, and Emperor Hirohito. So between 1945 and 1951, Japan was also occupied and was also disarmed so they could not wage war. However, the United States did allow a self-defense force so they could protect their own homeland. In 1947, the Constitution of Japan was established, and this is still in action today. Japan was turned into a parliamentary democracy in which they protected civil liberties. In this way, the United States and the Allies turned enemies into friends. Especially in the Pacific, Japan would prove to be a strong anti-communist ally during the Cold War. There was also the issue of justice. After all, terrible crimes against humanity were waged in World War II. At the same site where the racist Nuremberg laws were established, a series of trials were set up for Nazi leaders, soldiers, and sympathizers. In the most famous trial, 23 Nazi leaders were tried for crimes against humanity. Of the charged, 12 were sentenced to death, 8 were sentenced to life, and 3 were acquitted. Now, the most prominent Nazi who was there was Hermann Goering, but before he was hanged, he swallowed a cyanide pill, possibly given to him by a guard, and committed suicide. Nonetheless, the Nazis were declared a criminal organization, and many others were sentenced in subsequent trials. The Allies also engaged in a process of denazification, where they removed Nazis from government positions, industry, and education. The problem with this was that it removed many skilled workers and leaders. During the war, even those who were not sympathetic to the cause claimed themselves to be Nazis just so that they and their families would not be sent away or imprisoned or killed. And again, on the opposite side of the world, in Tokyo, there was a series of post-war trials as well. Now, it was estimated that more than 15 million Chinese citizens were killed at the hands of the Japanese from the 1930s through World War II, and millions more were brutalized. Furthermore, the Japanese treatment of others, including Allied POWs, was equally horrific. Thousands of Japanese were tried in 1946. and almost 1,000 were sentenced to death, and thousands more were sentenced to prison. As you can see, the most prominent leader, Hideki Tojo, who was there on trial, who was sentenced and summarily put to death. Emerging from the war with immense wealth and power, Americans had boundless faith in capitalist democracy and contempt for Soviet socialism. The Americans agreed to let Stalin take reparations from Germany, but only from the less developed Soviet-occupied zone, whose factories would be disassembled and sent east by rail. And from 1945 to 1948, Stalin used coercion and rigged elections to establish Soviet-dominated satellite regimes in places like Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. And on the map you see everything there in red. Former Prime Minister Winston Churchill, speaking in Missouri in March of 1946, evoked the image of a Europe divided by a line called the Iron Curtain, east of which lay countries imprisoned by communism.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere.
In the following year, reacting to a communist insurgency in Greece and to Soviet pressures against Turkey, President Truman proclaimed a new policy soon called the Truman Doctrine. As he said, the United States must support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. It didn't take a genius to realize he was talking about Soviet Russia. Now, Secretary of State George Marshall announced a massive program of U.S. economic aid to all of war-torn Europe, not just to Greece or Turkey. This Marshall Plan was designed to preclude communist expansion by strengthening Europe economically and advancing America's Cold War strategy. And that strategy was one of containment. The belief that had started years before with Nicholas Spykman was the fact that communism was inefficient, and if the United States could just keep them from spreading, they would fall apart from within. The country names you see highlighted in yellow were the ones who received funds from the Marshall Plan. Stalin reacted angrily to the United States initiatives. Realizing that the Marshall Plan aid would boost American influence in Europe, he ordered his Eastern European satellite nations to reject it and later formed a Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, basically called COMCON. And this was organized to advance their economic development. So the countries you see highlighted in the white are the ones who received money through COMCON, not to be confused with Comic-Con. Now, to back up just a little bit, in June of 1948, France merged its German occupation zone with the British and American sectors, uniting Western Germany and giving it a unified currency. And later that month, fearful that the West was moving to reunite and rebuild Germany, Stalin retaliated by blocking all roads and all rail routes from Western Germany to Berlin. This began the Berlin Blockade, the Cold War's first great crisis, and what many historians say really kicked off the Cold War. You see, since Berlin lay inside Soviet-occupied Eastern Germany, 90 miles behind the Iron Curtain, West Berlin depended on food and supplies delivered from Western Germany. So Truman opted, with British support, to supply West Berlin by air. For the next 11 months, American and British cargo planes flew food and supplies around the clock into West Berlin. Facing immense international pressure, Stalin quietly ended the blockade in May of 1949. The West could claim victory, and for the time being, the world was spared from further conflict.
Down for 3:30 that appointment.
Tonight is the night that you die! Ha 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 ha